the United States is currently over $36 trillion in debt. That has grown significantly. I'll let you tell me exactly how fast, but I want to say it's roughly doubled in the past 10 to 15 years. Estimates say that's the official number. There's also estimates of $220 trillion in unfunded liabilities. So at that, just the $36 trillion in debt, we're talking about 140% debt to GDP, which typically, historically, as I recall, is like basically unsustainable, right? Like any country that's gone to that level of debt to GDP has ultimately hyperinflated their currency. How did this get so out of hand? And what is this like? This sounds very abstract for a lot of people. And I think part of our job as thinkers in this complex space is to try and demystify it for people. So how can we explain how this got out of hand and what it actually means for people in their day-to-day lives?
So I think the part of it is the nature of the system, right? When you have a debt-based fiat monetary system, the debt, you create debt when you spend to offset the spending. Sort of this modern monetary theory accounting is government accounting. So some of it is just how that works. The other part is the part that is usually not talked about as much, which is we did really dumb things with the money. We made bad choices. In theory, if the government borrows money and invests it wisely in a way, or increases in debt, invests wisely in a way that it is economically positive value added, then the debt shouldn't really rise very much, right? You should be earned. There should be a positive rate of return. And so some of it is systemic of how the system is structured, but a lot of it, I looked at it the other day. We've increased debt since China entered the WTO in December of 2001. U.S. federal debt's gone up $30 trillion since December of 2001.
Okay,
of that
so
$36 trillion.
So 23 years, we've gone from 6 to 36.
Correct.
Staggering.
And we don't have high-speed rail all over this country. We haven't solved the war on drugs. We haven't solved the war on terror. We haven't solved children are not reading at a higher level. They're not healthier. They're sicker. We've not completely paid off Medicare, Medicaid. We have nothing to show for it.
I was going to say, we have nothing.
I mean, our highways have been kept in decent shape, but it's not like, you go around the world, our highways, some are better than others, but we're certainly not the envy of the world, which we ought to be having dropped 30 trillion. So what do we spend it on? Well, 8 trillion of it was in the Middle East, where we spent 20 years taking Afghanistan from the Taliban and then giving it back to them 20 years later. This is the very definition of a complete waste.
Right.
And if that was a business, and I understand that government is different than business, but from a conceptual standpoint, I think it's important to frame it this way. If that was a business, that would be a bad investment, a bad acquisition, and you would write it off. You would take a charge and you would write off the entire $8 trillion. And that's what needs to happen. The backstopping of the banks. Historically, in capitalism, what the U.S. through the IMF made everybody else in the world do when they had a great financial crisis like we had in 2008, the recipe was straightforward. Break up the big banks, wipe out the equity, bondholders take over the equity, fire the managements, fraudulent issues go to jail or go to trial, and if they're found guilty by their peers, they go to jail, and the system moves on. That would have been a very deflationary outcome to, back to our prior point, the wrong people, the politically tied people. That couldn't be allowed to happen. It wasn't allowed to happen. It could have been, but it wasn't. Okay, the choice then, if we're not going to let the costs of that crisis be taken out of the net worth of Wall Street executives, real estate in the tri-state market up in the Northeast, et cetera, the tax receipts in New York, what have you, then it gets added to the government's balance, the federal government's balance sheet. So that, again, there was no real payback there. We were keeping the banking system whole, after it had engaged in questionable behavior, at least unwise behavior, if not outright questionable, and in certain cases fraudulent. Fraud doesn't get compensated. When you're in a company, you do fraud, you don't say, well, that's still a good asset. It's a fraudulent asset. You bought a fraudulent business. Enron stock didn't stay at whatever, 80.
Right.
0. So we've got, I bring those examples up because I think a way to think about it for just sort of the average person to think about is we've got 30 trillion on our balance sheet, and some portion of it needs to be written down dramatically. It is wasted. It's gone. We spent it on nothing. We put it in a pile and lit it on fire. And yet we're still holding it there. And that then gets into, well, how do you do that? You can write it down, but you can't write it down. In the government world, in the sovereign world, those bonds are still the assets backing other collateral, and you'll go into a debt spiral, basically. Okay. Then the other alternative is you need to write something else up. And so far, we've written up the general price level.
Right.
And that's the way governments tend to do these things. They don't say, oops, we screwed up and look at all these mistakes we made. They kind of print the money, they raise the general price level, and they extend and pretend. And 20 years later, oh, well, it's not that much money anymore anyway.
And that's a very generous way to put it, I think, writing up the price level. I think you would agree, but it's taxing the poor, the middle class.
Yeah, and because you don't have the political courage to admit to what you did wrong. You want to be the man, you want to be the leader.
Yeah.
Great. When it goes wrong, when it gets right, you should get when it goes right, you should get the credit.
Right.
When it goes wrong,
take responsibility.
You should take responsibility. And that's a sort of something we're dealing with, I think, in our culture broadly, right? Yeah. It's like when you have, 6 and 8 and 9 figure golden parachutes for companies that are left in worse shape than when the exec gets there, it's probably not capitalism. I don't know what it is, but it's not capitalism. And in the same way, inflation is just how politicians are able to stay in power, keep doing what they're doing without having to admit that they screwed up, and the buck actually doesn't stop there. It's just a compensation scheme for Washington. And it's same as it ever was. I don't want to be one of these guys like, it's Washington. The same as it ever was, which is, it's not fine, but it's fine. Like, okay, great. I know what to do with that.
Yeah.
I'm watching, Bitcoin's at 95,000 because it's the same as it ever was. Like,
If you enjoyed this clip, click here for the full episode and here for more just like it. Also, like this video to help shine light on the corruption of money, and subscribe to stay connected. Thank you.